Hello and welcome to the International Energy Agency for this launch event for a new report that we have released on financing clean energy transitions in emerging and developing economies. My name is Tim Gould. I'm head of division here at the IEA for energy supply and investment outlooks. And the overall structure for today's event is as follows. We'll shortly be hearing from the leadership of the International Energy Agency, as well as from the World Bank and the World Economic Forum, two institutions with whom we collaborated on this analysis. Then we'll have a short presentation of some key findings from the report before moving on to a high-level roundtable discussion with some leading figures from the world of energy, infrastructure, and finance. So with thanks to you all for joining today's event, it's a great pleasure for me to pass the floor across to the Executive Director of the International Energy Agency, Dr. Fatih Birol.
Greetings to all the colleagues and friends from the International Energy Agency headquarters. Dear colleagues, I guess many of you are aware that 2 weeks ago we released a landmark study from IEA, which is how the global energy sector can help to reach our net zero 2050 target, so that the temperature increase, global temperature increase is about 1.5 degrees or below. We made this analysis, and the overall message coming from this analysis is we still have a pathway to reach our target, 1.5 degrees in 2050, but this pathway is very narrow, but still achievable. And at the launch of this report, I said we all talk about the race to net zero. But this race, first of all, I wanted to say that it is a race not among the countries, but it is a race against the time. That's number one. Number two, this race is, many countries start this race in front of the others. Developed countries start in front of the developing nations. And third, the very nature of the problem, unless everybody finishes the race, nobody wins the race. And when we look at the global energy demand, emission trends, when I look at the numbers carefully, it is our job at the IEA to look at the numbers carefully, we see a critical fault line of our global efforts to reach our climate goals, which is financing clean energy investments in the emerging world. It is the very reason we are today launching this study, as my colleague Mr. Gould mentioned, with the support in collaboration with the World Bank and World Economic Forum. I am thankful to both of these esteemed organizations. We also had a high-level advisory panel, and we benefited from their advice throughout this study. And several of them are joining us today in our roundtable discussion, including Mr. Mark Gallagher, who is a senior advisor to US President for Climate, Mrs. Amani Abu Zaid, the Commissioner for Energy in African Union, Mr. Gurdeep Singh, Chairman of the NTPC of India, and Mrs. Nandita Parshad, who is the Managing Director for Sustainable Infrastructure at EBRD in London. In addition to those colleagues, we had other, of course, distinguished colleagues in our advisory board, including Mr. Ken Rogoff, former chief economist at the IMF, or, for example, Mr. Toyoda, from Japanese Institute of Energy Economics. We are grateful to our advisory panel members. This study, dear colleagues, we carried out at the IEA, a big group of a team, in fact, led by my colleague, Mr. Tim Gould. When there is a difficult subject about economy, investment, finance, I always turn Mr. Gould to take care of that, together with his colleague, Mark Waldron, who is going to present our study. They made excellent work. But I should tell you that there is many interesting aspects of the study, but one of them is important to underline. In order to make this study, we made over 50 case studies. Different countries, from Bangladesh to Brazil, from Vietnam to India, covering many underground clean energy projects. What works, what doesn't work, we learned a lot from those and made our report. You may well say that this is, we watch a lot of movies in these COVID days. It is based on a true story, our story that we are going to tell you now. Now, why it is important? Why IEA focus on this subject? Why we have chosen this subject? Again, a few numbers. As I said, we are a number, evidence-driven organization. Today, the countries we are focusing in this report make more than 2/3 of the global population. 2/3 of the global population. And they are, without changing the policies, they are responsible more than 90% of the global emission increase. Yet, they are accounting about only 20% of global clean energy investments. And for me, this is the critical fault line for us, for the world, reaching our climate goals. How we can speed up the flow of clean energy investments in the emerging world in order to reach our energy and climate goals. Now, our report shows that today, the total amount of clean energy investments flowing in the developing world is about 150 billion US dollars. And in order to be in line with our climate goals, this number needs to go about 1 trillion US dollar annually, from 150 billion to 1 trillion, a 7 times of an increase. Huge increase is needed. It is a very difficult job, especially given the current economic context we are in. But there is one important point that I want to underline, which, in my view, brings a interesting and a useful dimension to entire climate change mitigation discussions. It is the following. My colleagues' analysis show that the reducing emissions in the emerging world costs only half of it what it costs in the advanced economies. So it is much cheaper to reduce emissions in the emerging world compared to developed world. This provides, in my view, a very important opportunity. As we all know, 1 ton of CO2 going to atmosphere from Jakarta or from Detroit or from Liverpool or from Zurich, it has the same effect on everybody. So therefore, in my view, this is a great opportunity. Now, when we look at the investments need to happen in the emerging world, we see that investments need to go in the direction of a more capital-intensive investments. The investment we are talking about, the renewable investments, the electric cars, grid expansion, they are in the beginning, they need high amount of upfront investments, and we also know that the financial costs, the cost of capital in the emerging world is much higher than in United States or in Europe, and our numbers show that the difference, the financing cost, the nominal financing cost in the emerging world is up to 7 times higher than it is in North America or in Europe. So what needs to be done? First of all, in the countries where the investment needs to happen, the governments there needs to have a clear vision and supportive policy and regulatory framework. This is a job for those countries in order to attract the investment, because our numbers show that there is enough capital in the world, but how does this capital meet the projects in those countries? And therefore, a fertile ground needs to be prepared for the domestic governments there. We have less worry that the global capital meets the clean energy investments in the developed world, in the advanced economies, but more worried in the developing economies. This is one job for the host governments to prepare to have a clear vision and come up with supportive, clear regulatory frameworks. But there is another job, which is for the advanced economies. We believe that there is a role, a catalyst role, can be played by the advanced economies and for the international financial institutions around the world. And it is one of the reasons we come up with the rather message that the governments around the world need to cement financing clean energy transitions in the developing world as a strategic mandate, as an imperative for all international public finance institutions. We know that there will be a G7 meeting, leaders meeting soon. Afterwards, a G20 meetings. The governments are meeting and discussing this, and therefore we would be very happy to see that the government leaders give a strategic mandate to international financial institutions to make the clean energy financing as a key priority. Finally, as the head of the International Energy Agency, I would like to appeal to the advanced economies, the leaders of the advanced economies, to say that, in my personal view, to address this very important problem by the advanced economies is a moral responsibility. But at the same time, an economic and the climate opportunity, giving the lower cost of mitigation in those countries. I wanted to thank you once again for joining this meeting, and I would like to turn to my colleague, Mr. Tim Gould. Very many thanks, Tim, for once again carrying out such a very important topic and bringing it to the attention of the international energy and climate community together with Mike and the other members of your team. Over to you, Tim.
Thank you very much, Executive Director. We'd now like to go to opening remarks from the institutions with whom we collaborated on this special report, starting with Ms. Marie Pangestu, the Managing Director for Development Policy and Partnerships at the World Bank.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this launch event. First of all, a big congratulations to the IEA team on this very, very important report. I want to mention also another report that World Bank, IEA, IRENA, WHO, and the UN released on the Tracking SDG 7 report, just for context, that, in that report, we noted that despite rapid progress over the last decade, we found that unless efforts are scaled up significantly in countries with the largest deficits, the world will fall short of ensuring universal access to energy by 2030. 760 million people still lack access to electricity. And the report also talks about the need to scale up financing and improve access to electricity to reach the 2030 targets. And as Fatih mentioned, it's an unequal race because if you look at the data, the investments has been unequal and concentrated only in a small number of countries. So if we want to reach 2030 universal access to energy and the 2050 net zero emissions by 2050, a massive scale up of investment is clearly needed. Fatih mentioned a number, 1 trillion. We just know it's going to be huge. But that's the kind of the end of the story, if you like. To get there, how do we get there? We have to start with having a good design, evidence-based, as Fatih mentioned, long-term decarbonization plans in the various countries that we work in, and that recognizes the interaction between people, planet, and the economy. This is vital. And this is the focus of the World Bank Group's green, resilient, and inclusive development approach to recovery and growth, which we are developing right now together with our upcoming climate change action plan, where we identified the 5 key transformative systems that need to change for us to get to both climate and development objectives. And energy is one of them. It's energy, transport, food and land use, urban infrastructure, and manufacturing, because they contribute 90% of emissions. And they also contribute to what you need to do to develop. And energy is by far the largest contributor. So the IEA report is really going to help lay out several important solutions, and based on the true story case studies that countries can learn from as they develop their long-term plans. So the World Bank Group is working a lot on energy transition for climate and development. And this basically comprises of the elements that are emphasized in the report. First, what kind of transformative investments are needed? Say in energy, how do you go to clean energy? How do you have access based on clean energy and also have resilience and adaptation for the countries that don't have the electricity? And then how do you transition out of fossil-based fuel for the countries that are already using fossil-based fuel now? What's a just transition out of that? And second, for the investments to be realized, we will need policy reforms, regulatory changes, institutional strengthening, and technology enablers. And I think the narrative has to be about opportunities. I happened to participate in IRENA Renewable Energy Initiative some 2-3 years ago. And this is what we said. The narrative has to be about opportunities. That this is about opportunities from the fast declining cost of renewable energy and energy storage technologies, combined with innovative business models that offer significant opportunities to expand energy access and accelerate the energy transition, as well as create jobs and growth. I think this is really the link that we have to continue to make. And third, of course, the end of the story. How do we finance the investments? both from the public and the private sector at the scale that is needed. This is really where we really need to work together. You know, the World Bank is doing its part. We have 35% of climate finance now in our new climate change action plan. Over the past 5 years, we have committed 8.4 billion in direct clean energy investments, and we are going to continue to do that. And as an institution, we have also committed to being Paris aligned by 2023 for the World Bank, and IFC and MIGA by 2025. So we are also would like to see that there will be Paris alignment for mobilizing capital for green and low carbon investments and managing climate risks by all other institutions, including the private sector. So let me just close by saying that I think we all need to be in this together. There is the what to do, and then the how to, and within the how to, long-term low carbon development plans for the developing countries and emerging economies are important to be able to say, okay, private sector, public sector, which parts are you going to be investing in, and that there will be a long-term perspective on undertaking these investments, and more resources will be needed. I think I would like to join Fatih's call for international cooperation in the resources that will be needed. MDBs will come in with our concessional and grant financing and catalyzing private investment where we can, but much, much more will be needed, and more resources will be needed if we're going to reach SDG target of universal access, as well as net zero emissions by 2050. We need to work together to ensure that people are at the center of the people, planet, and economy future. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these opening remarks, and indeed thank you very much to colleagues from across the World Bank who shared their experiences and knowledge with us as we put together this analysis. Now I'd like to turn to Mr. Børge Brende, who is the President of the World Economic Forum, for his opening remarks.
Well, thank you, Tim. Thank you to Fatih and also Marie for a great collaboration and your leadership. I'm joining you here from Geneva at our headquarters, and listening to the two presentations, it is really clear that in the years to come, we also need to strengthen the public-private collaboration to meet both the important targets on climate, but also universal access to energy. And we have to mobilize governments, companies, innovators, and also young people to create a positive change on these key global issues. As Fatih also alluded to, it is very clear that the cost of action is the lowest in many developing countries. Half the price, in fact, with many of the mitigation initiatives that are necessary. And also, as Marie underlined, we have to make sure that close to 1 billion people that don't even have access to basic electricity today, not thinking about the 2 billion that also have very unhealthy ways of even doing their cooking, needs to have access. But how do we then decouple this access to electricity and energy from the growth in CO2 emissions? I think a good starting point would be that we then start with the lowest hanging fruits. And the lowest hanging fruits are in many developing countries. So we will have to do the initiatives related, of course, to mitigation. But then we also have to have clear pathways for more sustainable energy. So, Fatih, you have eloquently shared the key report findings, but also let me offer a few reflections on what I feel stand out as some of the key messages, and also the contributions from the World Economic Forum. We definitely need to exponentially invest in clean energy, and as I mentioned, in emerging economies. And it's not only a challenge, but also a massive opportunity, with added benefits such as the creation of jobs and other economic activities. We also have to bear in mind that additionally many of the ingredients to make these investments happen are already in place. The majority of emission reductions can be achieved through technologies that are mature today, and at the global scale capital is also available. But what will be an additional challenge in the years to come is with the unparalleled stimulus that has been out there now through governments, we will also have to rely more on the private sector on many of these projects moving forward, because there definitely is not that much of fiscal ammunition and muscles left in the years to come. So I do wholeheartedly support the recommendations in this report, and I hope it will serve as a basis for increased efforts at national and international levels. The World Economic Forum has already started an initiative to facilitate some of these tasks and also these actions. The forum is definitely committed to enabling public-private collaboration that can be fast-tracked and can fast-track transition to energy systems that are more inclusive, sustainable, and affordable and secure. To facilitate action, the World Economic Forum has created a global task force which provide input to this report through peer review and case studies. The task force will continue with a focus on driving impact in 3 ways. First, building momentum and coalitions to implement several bold proposals that have the potential to overcome current barriers and make a real difference. These include areas such as the use of corporate purchase power agreements or PPAs to accelerate investments in renewable energy, and also, not at least, the creation of innovative forms of financing to make projects more bankable. Second, creation of an online repository with case studies, best practices, and recommendations for policymakers and the project developers. Third, organizing deep dives in the key emerging countries, such as Brazil or India, in partnership with relevant local stakeholders to really support the necessary action. I think if we're going to meet the SDGs and the 2 key targets on net zero and clean technology and access to energy, we will need really to collaborate on these efforts. And we have to also think out of the box. And as I said, we are willing to also do our job in mobilizing the private sector. And we have seen things happening just the last decade that have illustrated that it is possible to change the course. If you 10 years ago had said that solar would be 1/10 of the price compared to today, people would say that, no, that's not realistic. If you said that wind would be 1/7 of the price in a decade, it would not be seen as realistic. And this, I think, also showed by your report, Fatih, on the IEA report, shows that we also have to now develop the technologies that are not currently available to meet the targets for 2050. So this is underlining also the financial needs for many developing countries. And of course, you can look at the cost of action, the money we have to invest, but let's focus also the cost of inaction in this area that far exceeds the cost of action. So let's roll up our sleeves and implement this report. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the President of the World Economic Forum, Mr. Borja Brenda, for these opening remarks, and also for the collaboration and insights that we gained from the task force that he mentioned. That's been incredibly valuable. We will move on shortly to our roundtable discussion. But before doing that, we wanted to take a few moments to explore some of the findings of the new report in a bit more depth. And there's no one better place to do that than my colleague, Michael Waldron, who led the team that put together this analysis. So, Mike, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tim. Thank you as well to Executive Director Dr. Birol, and also for the opening remarks from the World Bank colleague, Ms. Pangestu, and the WEF President, Børge Brende. I'm going to briefly set out some of the main messages from the report and unpack and illustrate some of the concepts that the Executive Director talked about in his opening remark. And I'm going to cover broadly 3 areas. First, I'm going to unpack what is needed in terms of energy investments in emerging and developing economies. Also look at the types of finance that will be critical for attracting these investments for clean energy transitions, and then to conclude by discussing some of the priorities and the case studies that illustrate how to attract this capital in practice. So building off of several years of efforts that we have done in tracking investments around the world as part of our World Energy Investment Project, we have a good sense of the energy projects and the financial flows that characterize the investment landscape globally, but in particular in emerging and developing economies. But what we observe in recent years is that clean energy investments in this part of the world have been stuck. As our Executive Director communicated, they're around 150 billion in 2020. They declined by 8% from 2019, and we expect only about a slight rebound in 2021. So there's a persistent stagnation of these investments in this part of the world. We've also seen the share of clean energy as part of total energy investment. This has risen somewhat, as you can see by the red dots going up. But this rise has more to do with the weakness in investment that we've seen in fossil fuel sectors rather than any particular strength in clean energy, despite the fact that we do see some strong investment trends in some countries recently. So, for example, solar PV in India and Vietnam, for example. Now, in order to meet clean energy goals and to put the world on track for net zero emissions by 2050, we need to be seeing over $1 trillion of annual investment in clean energy in these regions by 2030. And what does this mean in terms of the different sectors? Well, it means we need to see a massive scale up in clean power investments, including solar, wind, but also hydropower, geothermal. Right now, solar PV and wind are some of the lowest cost forms of new generation for these economies. So the affordability issue is there, and these technologies can actually be part of a very affordable, sustainable energy transition. But we also need to see a lot more spending in terms of managing demand and electrifying demand, and in terms of the end-use sectors. So more spending on energy efficiency in buildings and transport and industry, a massive ramp up in the sales of electric vehicles. At the same time, we also need to see progress in decarbonizing some of the more difficult sectors, such as heavy industry and fuel-intensive industries. So seeing more investments in low-carbon fuels, such as hydrogen, but also carbon capture and storage. The share of investments under this projection would rise to about 2/3 of the total energy investments. So the big question is how to finance these investments. And this is essentially what the report tries to do uniquely among IEA publications. And we assess that a wide range of financing instruments and approaches are going to be needed, encompassing financial flows ranging from local domestic sources to international sources. And what this report does is it projects the primary sources of finance for energy projects over 4 parameters. It looks at the type of provider, it looks at the type of instrument, it looks at the origin of the finance, and it looks at the financing structure. And in this slide right here, we're going to focus on 2 of these parameters. So compared with advanced economies, today's energy investments in emerging and developing economies rely heavily on public sources of finance. This reflects the traditional role of state-owned enterprises and governments in motivating investments. There's also a relatively high share of investment that's done on an equity basis, on a balance sheet basis. And this also reflects the sort of mix of energy in energy investments. So the domination of fuel supply investments in particular, which tend to be financed with higher levels of equity. But in our climate-driven scenarios, we find that the sources of finance would need to shift towards a greater role of private capital and a greater role of debt finance. And these trends are even more pronounced when you isolate the clean energy investments, so the $1 trillion that I showed you on the previous slide. Notably, over 70% of clean energy investments would need to come from private sources. So these sources include private project developers, the commercial banks, institutional investors, especially in the sectors of renewables and energy efficiency. At the same time, debt finance becomes more important as energy becomes more capital intensive, based on financing models that are more reliant on the presence of long-term predictable cash flows or energy savings that support project bankability. And the availability of low-cost local currency debt also becomes more important. Now, public sources of finance, including state-owned enterprises, continue to play vital roles, particularly given the role they play as state-owned utilities who are the primary investors in electricity networks, which is an important source of enabling investments to integrate all the clean energy investments. And equity risk capital also still plays a very important role, particularly in funding new technologies in riskier, earlier stages of project development. Amid all this, we see a need for an enhanced role for international finance institutions as a critical element to catalyze all these private investments. And this would especially involve the expansion or the enhancement of blended finance from development finance institutions to attract investment, in particular with those with hard to mitigate risks and in markets and sectors at early stages of readiness. Now, what does this financing picture mean for the energy sector, for energy transitions? Well, the financing in many ways reflects the evolving cost structure of the energy system under clean energy transitions. And the affordability of these transitions increasingly depend on managing the cost of capital. We observe that as emerging and developing economies invest more in clean energy, such as solar, wind, electric vehicles, also enabling infrastructure, the grids, the energy system becomes more capital intensive. It becomes more reliant on technologies with higher upfront costs, where financing plays a greater role in the overall cost of transition. But this shift towards a more capital-intensive energy system is particularly challenging in geographies where capital has been traditionally constrained. Now, this slide shows you how the picture would play out in the power sector under IEA climate-driven scenarios. So overall, power supply costs would rise by half to 2030 in emerging and developing economies. As you can see by the green columns, a greater share goes towards increased investment in power plant capital recovery and also investment in the fixed assets of the grid. But this also results in operating cost savings. So you can also see the blue part, the blue share on the right graph going down. And this comes primarily from reduced consumption of fossil fuels that were used in thermal power plants and coal and gas-fired power plants. So the total cost of the transition is an opportunity that can be realized relatively affordably when you're looking at it from the standpoint of investment needs plus operating savings. And in this report, in the first chapter, we show how, when looking at the power and end-use sectors together, the cost of a climate-driven scenario is only around 5% higher than under the current development pathway. Of course, securing the capital to make the upfront investments then becomes the critical factor to make this happen. And here's where we'll turn to the cost of capital. And we observe that while global capital is abundant, there's a big difference in the cost of finance around the world. Over the past few years, economy-wide financing costs, so we're looking at this on an indicative basis before even coming to the energy sector. So what investors or what developers, the types of financing costs they would face just by being operating in a certain economy. These financing costs have broadly come down in the past few years with more accommodative global financial conditions, expansionary monetary policy, et cetera, and also sort of lower government benchmark bond yields and falling equity market risk premia. However, for the moment, as you can see by the graph, and this gives you kind of a representative sample of countries, capital is significantly more expensive in the emerging and developing economies where the capital is most needed. This is due to more persistent macroeconomic risks and domestic capital constraints. We find in the report that over 90% of the investments that would need to come in emerging and developing economies are in countries where the banking and capital markets are underdeveloped. So the supply of capital is already constrained in local currency terms. Domestic savings are unevenly distributed across emerging regions, and due to the COVID-19 pandemic, debt burdens are on the rise in a number of economies. All these factors tend to constrain the cost of finance, the availability of finance, and raise its costs. Now, putting it all together, when we're looking at financing costs, we see, as our executive director said, that they're up to 7 times above those values for the United States and Europe, with even higher values in riskier markets and riskier segments, such as consumers or small and medium-sized enterprises. This points to a relatively high bar for investments in accessing debt finance and meeting equity return hurdle rates. But it also means that with good policy reforms on the energy side, you can do a lot to help to try to reduce this gap. And so this is what I'd like to focus on in the next slide. And as I mentioned, or as we've mentioned before, we have around 50 case studies in this slide that illustrate nearly 20 priority actions of how to attract capital in practice. And this shows that the shift is possible based on these success stories around the world. The first category of these that I show right here recognizes that an international catalyst is needed to boost clean energy investment in emerging and developing economies. And this has been well covered by the earlier remarks, but it reinforces this notion of having a strong mandate, boosting the efficiency of the delivery of climate finance, as well as enhancements to use of blended capital. But both international stakeholders and emerging and developing economies need to address the cross-cutting and the sector-specific actions that help to get investments moving on the ground. And you can see these are illustrated in the next three buckets, and I'd like to just cite a few examples so you understand the kind of flavor of the cases we have in the report. One of these is making it easier to prepare clean energy projects with new financing facilities and the creation of one-stop shops, as we observe in Morocco and India. Another one of these priorities is in enhancing the financial performance of utilities, and we have cases on this from Colombia and from Kenya. We looked at ways to harness investor readiness to back renewable power, and we see the institution of competitive auction frameworks with blended finance in Argentina and Brazil being instrumental for that. We looked at a priority of efficiency, how to embed efficiency in new buildings and appliances, and the programs which are undertaken in Mexico and South Africa to promote those. Promoting more electrified and efficient mobility, as we've observed in cases in Thailand and with electric buses in Uganda, and also recasting the development model of oil and gas producer economies, as well as starting to lay the groundwork for the scale-up of low-emissions fuels in fuel supply and energy and emissions-intensive industries, with a number of cases, including those from Egypt, Bangladesh, Singapore, and also looking at the cement industry worldwide. There's a number of other details and cases and examples in the report, ranging from solutions for electricity access and clean cooking to scaling up smart grids to addressing the emissions of existing coal-fired power plants. And we see that the benefits from this type of shift are huge. You can create a lot of new jobs associated with clean energy investments and activities when the right skilling programs and capacities are built at the local level. But it's also important for governments to recognize the need to ensure that clean energy transitions are people-centered and inclusive as they transition from fossil fuels, so to make a just transition inclusive for everyone. So with that, I will conclude and hand it back to Tim. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. That sets the scene up very nicely for our high-level roundtable discussion. We're very lucky to have four distinguished speakers to join us, and they've indeed provided insight and advice throughout this process. I'd like to do some brief introductions. First of all, Mark Galogli, who's Senior Advisor to the US Special Presidential Envoy for Climate and someone with vast experience in the world of private finance. We're delighted to be joined by Commissioner Abu Zaid from the African Union Commission, who's worked tirelessly to raise awareness and the profile of Africa's energy and infrastructure issues. We have Mr. Gurdeep Singh, who's Chairman and Managing Director of NTPC, India's largest power utility, who's always full of insights on the real-world issues affecting investments in that country. And we have Nandita Parshad, Managing Director of Sustainable Infrastructure at the EBRD, who's leading the bank's focus on sustainable energy, transport, and social infrastructure. Thank you all very much for joining us today. I'd just like to turn to Mark, if I can, first. We've heard a lot about the importance of international action to support these clean energy transitions. You know very well what it takes to get private capital to flow to these kinds of energy projects. So what more should major economies be doing to mobilize private investment in clean energy transitions in the sort of countries that we've been talking about today?
Tim, thank you very much. A quick word about, before I begin, about IEA. I've been an investor for about 35 years in the private sector. I joined the State Department about 3.5 months ago. So when I look around the panel, I recognize that there are really remarkably deep expertise in what we're talking about today, and that my background is focused on one sliver of this. So I want to come here with a certain amount of humility around that. When I look at the IEA, the way that they approach problems like this around rigor for numbers and clear statements for what the reality is, such as it's a race against time, we only win if we all win. These sort of things are so true. Or the statement that 90% of global emissions are coming from the markets that we're talking about, but we're allocating 20% of the capital. This summarizes what the challenge is in a very clear way. This report provides a remarkable roadmap for many of us to understand these issues in a deeper way. In my short time, I'd make a few comments. The world is full of capital. Rates are unbelievably low. The world has decided on the good news side that ESG is a really important initiative. And for a variety of reasons that many of you have personally been involved in, and that some of the leaders in finance have been involved in the NGO world, capital is moving more rapidly than ever to the ESG world. The question is, the capital is located in the wrong places. And so what are we going to do about that? What are we going to do about that? I think that we have to recognize the level and the depth of the challenge. If time is our enemy, and if we look at the size of the facilities that are being considered by some of the most important institutions on the planet, there's a disconnect. The dollars being thought about are not consistent with the need. And every year matters. So if we get it together later, it's a bigger problem today. There are a couple of real bright spots. I see my fellow panelists from India, and I think, okay, in February and March, $5 billion of US capital, bond market capital, went into the Indian, mostly renewable markets, because the scale of the companies have become larger, because some of the policy issues that need to be made have been made. Nothing's perfect, but directionally, that's a big improvement. To get to 450 gigs, there needs to be more capital. But the reality is that capital is flowing in a way and at a price that historically has not been present. This opportunity presents itself in multiple other places. And for me, the core issue, whether the phrase is that Fatih and his team are using around a strategic mandate, or for me, I'd say, what is the key performance indicator of any multilateral institution for the next several years around climate? What is it? And I believe it has to be, how much capital did we mobilize? Aggregate. If the institutions themselves, which have done tremendous work, all of the institutions that are on this panel that I'm participating in, have for years done incredible work. But if the question is, how much capital did we mobilize? Are we mobilizing to the amount that's necessary to the problem? If not, why not? This has to be reimagined, because even though this has not been my world has been trying to think about the probability of a projection happening. That's what investors are doing. What's the probability weighted that someone is telling you is going to happen? Right now, the probability that we hit these numbers based upon what I am seeing in conversations around blended finance, the size of the vehicles, the speed with which they're acting, are we going to hit these numbers? It doesn't feel very good to me. So with that, I'll stop, and happy to come back and forth with some of the folks who have had more experience in that than I have. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark. I'd like to go across now to Commissioner Abu Zeid and get your reactions to a couple of points that have come up already. I mean, in the opening remarks, there was lots of references to the opportunities here. And so I wanted to get a sense from you, based on your experience of all across different parts of Africa, where do you see the biggest opportunities in clean energy? And also, perhaps you could also speak then about a few of the biggest constraints from your perspective.
Thank you very much. And first, allow me to congratulate IEA and everyone, really, and to congratulate all of us, since we are all partners, for this remarkable report, which is very timely, given the need and given the opportunity, if I may say. Let me start by the need. Again, I do believe that we all know that Africa, we have almost 655 million Africans who do, till this very day, have no access to electricity and to energy. That's a very serious constraint for the continent's growth, for the people's well-being. Now, when it comes to investments required from 2019 to 2040 for Africa to bridge this energy gap, we're talking $2.6 trillion. That's 2.4% of our GDP. Then how to go about that, and this is where I'm going to talk also about the challenges and the opportunity. Of course, I mean, Africa, as we all know, has abundantly renewable energy sources, which means that when harnessed, we can provide 100% access to African population. This is hindered by several factors. Hindered by the fact that one, Africa is often perceived as risky, and I think all studies has proven that Africa is not riskier than any other region in the world, if not as risky, if you consider it risky. Two, it's also a fragmented market. When we say Africa, we are not. We are talking about 55 countries and 55 small economies, 55 policies and regulations. That's again a hindrance when it comes to investment. Third, what I hear, and I'm sure everybody around the table and beyond has heard, when they say Africa, there are no bankable projects. Or that there are no projects ready on the table. Now, let me dispel the myth and go straight to the opportunities. First, as I did speak to the risk element, but when it comes to packaging, it is timely because this year we have adopted the new set of regional and transcontinental projects in infrastructure, including energy, going from 2021 for the next 10 years, was adopted in February. And in January, the African Free Trade Area entered into operation, and we started trading starting 4th of January of 2021. Everyone is speaking recovery, and very often at the heart of this recovery, digitalization is mentioned. Guess how digitalization is going to work with energy? Guess how this operationalization of free trade area going to transport goods or help people move around? Well, energy is needed. How are they going to transact again energy, industrialize energy? So whether you're talking development, structural development issues in Africa and or recovery from COVID, energy is at the heart of it. And specifically renewable energy, given also its abundance, but given the fact that under COVID we were exposed in terms of vulnerability when the supply chains were interrupted. Africa has, and we all understood that we have to depend on ourselves. So what is available here and now, but renewable energy, which we have abundantly. And Fatih explained, and it has been also again proven that the cost has drastically reduced, for this technology. So for all kinds of reasons, this is timely and this is important. Third, and last but not least, when it comes to fragmented economies, we have taken upon it ourselves in the African Union to create this large market. To create also an economy of scale. So it's not only the free trade area. Only last week I launched the Single African Electricity Market, which aims to have the 100% access in 2040 using renewable energy. And this month, again, we are launching our strategy for resources mobilization that will look into other sources of funding, not just government or public funding, but also how to mobilize the private sector, how to mobilize institutional investors, and so on and so forth. And we continue working with our member countries, meaning all African countries, in terms of improving the investment climate, because at the end of the day, it is an investment and an important one to be made. When it comes to policies and regulations and harmonization, we continue a very serious work of harmonizing the policies and regulations so as to also make it easier for investors to invest in regional cross-border projects, not just national ones. And we even have instruments, financial instruments to support, this very first phase when it comes to packaging, bankability, studies, preparations for the project on a draft basis. We have several of them across the continent. So we're putting together all these elements to help or to attract investments in infrastructure in general, but particularly specifically to renewable energy. And I think.
Thank you very much indeed, Commissioner. I'd like to turn now to Mr. Gurdeep Singh from NTPC. We heard from Mike that a large share of the investment that's required in rapid clean energy transitions will need to come from the private sector. But the situation today is that large companies, large state-owned companies, are very prominent in today's investment flows. So I'd like to get a perspective from you on how can companies like yours, or big players within the existing system, how can you best support this process of change?
Thank you. And good evening from Delhi. I'm sure that it's a different time zone, so maybe it's a good morning, good afternoon to everyone. First of all, thank you, IEA and Dr. Birol in particular for involving us in this study. And we had been part of some of the discussions which happened. And I'm quite enthused by the discussions what is happening today, and most of the points which have been brought in. I think one of the key things which is very clearly brought out is the cost of the capital, and it was already mentioned very clearly that the capital is there, but where is the capital and where it is needed most, and how we can bring it where it is required most. It was clearly mentioned by Dr. Birol that the 1 ton of carbon dioxide, whether it is released in any part of the globe, it is having the same impact. Whereas it required almost half of the investment to mitigate the same in the developing part of the world. And the cost of the capital is going from anywhere from double to the 7 times. So I think this really sets the tone very clear that the requirement of the capital is in the developing EMDE, what has been described. The point is at what cost and how this capital can really flow, and how we can, as a global village, how we can support each other and run together against the time, what Fatih just mentioned, to achieve this, our common target. Now, I think it has been clearly mentioned that the public finances are not sufficient. I think the private finances are necessary to come in. And Mark just mentioned that we in India have been doing everything. The government of India has been doing everything on the side of the policies, regulations, and enabling the investment. And in particular, I can say about the NTPC and our other sister concern, SECI, who have been able to sign the power purchase agreement with the developers and in turn take the risk of the payment by signing the power purchase agreements with the state discoms. I think this has really enabled quite a lot. The other things, what policy-wise, what we have taken is, this is a must run. The other things includes like the waiver of the transmission charges. In India, we believe that by policies and regulation, we have helped and we have provided the environment to attract the capital, both from the equity side as well as from the debt side. And this is not a kind of only one point of the destination. This is a journey till we reach to the this more and more renewable and decarbonized. I think the name itself is the low carbon, requires the low cost of capital. I think this is very simple in straightforward, but at the same time, we should not forget the jobs. I think that is very, very important. The transition has to be little painless if it is not fully painless. It cannot be just abrupt and it will be painful journey to many. Specifically about the companies like the state-owned companies like us, we are going ahead with a very ambitious, like the 60 gigawatt of the renewable energy in the next 10 years. And we are even thinking of joining hands with the private sector, wherein we will be enabling the investment to come and try to promote more and more renewable energy. And more so, I think the focus should be towards how we can really bring the investment in the new technologies of the storage. Because unless we really work on those technologies also and bring the investment, whether it is battery, whether it is going to be green hydrogen, and more particularly carbon capture and utilization. Because in the next 2 or 3 decades, we will have to depend mainly on the coal side unless and until we are having the storage as a very, very affordable. So accessibility, availability, and affordability, these 3 things are very important. We are already, Jayane, this work, we have worked and we have shown, demonstrated to the world that how we connected 2.6 crores, what we got 26 million houses in a period of 18 months and provided the clean cooking mechanism of LPG to almost every nook and corner of the country, which is like what the earlier speaker was saying about Africa. We are more or less a continent rather than a country the size of this. So my submission here is that we should focus that how we can have the long-term and the low-cost capital, both in terms of the equity as well as debt. And this should be not only the development financing institution, but I think the private sector has to play an important role. What we can provide is, we can provide some kind of the perceived risk we can really mitigate. And we have done that in many ways, like what I explained. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gurdeep. I'd like to turn now to Nandita Parshad from the EBRD. You heard the Executive Director talk earlier on about the need for a strong strategic mandate for international public finance institutions. You heard Mark Galogli talk a second ago about this key indicator being how much additional private capital are institutions like your own raising. So I'd like to get your perspective on some of those questions as a major international lender. I mean, what do you think of the sort of missing elements in the international response to some of the things we've talked about today?
Thank you very much, Tim. And first, let me just say it's really been a privilege for EBRD and myself personally to be part of the advisory group. And thank you for giving us the opportunity to contribute to this excellent report today. So let me take your question in 2 parts, I think. One is, the question of, what should donor governments be doing more of in terms of their involvement with IFIs and through IFIs? And this I see very, very important, because this is the developing world and what it's going to do to deliver for emerging markets. And donor governments really have 2 key roles to play in IFIs. One is they can shape their strategy and focus. And 2, as donors, they can provide the much needed resources for blended finance and help in designing and implementing the wide range of policy measures this report so clearly identifies. So just to share how we at EBRD feel the hand of our donors and our shareholders and how they are pushing us to prioritize this transition. So in 2020, our shareholders approved a 5-year strategic capital framework in which the bank committed to becoming a majority green financing bank by 2025. So by 2025, half of all of our financing, that's both our direct investing and mobilization, has to be in green finance and for green projects. In 2018, the EBRD had already adopted an energy strategy where we exited all coal and upstream oil financing. But more recently, working closely with our board, many of whom represent donor governments, we have refined our approach further to restrict all fossil fuel investments to very exceptional circumstances. Only projects that are fully aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement and also actively contribute to accelerating the low carbon transition. So this means from now on in energy, we really focus only on clean energy investing. And finally, in our upcoming annual meeting, which is at the end of this month, we expect shareholders to adopt a resolution that will commit EBRD to align all of our operations and investments with the goals of the Paris Agreement by 31st December 2022. This is something Mari spoke about as well as a commitment that the World Bank Group is making as well. And these are actually really important commitments because they do shape how IFIs are going to operate and how we're going to prioritize where we invest and also all of our activities more broadly. So for example, as Mark mentioned, this will impact directly our KPIs. My KPIs now, my scorecard, even for sustainable infrastructure investing, has not only a total investing and mobilizing figure, but a figure for how much I'm going to do in green finance. It will also influence how we assess and select projects. With a commitment to Paris alignment, every investment project will now routinely include an assessment of climate-related risks, as well as alignment with climate goals. I'm just coming out of a board meeting this morning where we had a rather intense discussion about whether we should continue to finance airports, while we also got huge kudos for bringing a project supporting distribution grids in Romania. And by the way, one board member even quoted the IEA roadmap report to highlight the importance of investing in grids. So you can see the role that our shareholders and donor governments are going to play will directly influence how and what we do as IFIs. And also finally, it shapes our policy dialogue and the kind of support we provide to policymakers. So for example, now, the big area of focus, and it won't just be for EBRD, I heard Mari mention it for the World Bank as well, will be supporting countries to design their own pathways to meet the Paris Agreement goals. Adoption and implementation of robust NDCs, sectoral low carbon pathways in order to create investment opportunities and a pipeline of bankable projects. And so the second way that donor governments play a crucial role is as donors, both as providers of international climate funds, as well as funds to support us IFIs directly. The report rightly notes the crucial role that climate funds will play in providing blended finance to catalyze private investment and reduce the capital cost of financing clean investments. IFIs are key implementers of such climate funds. For example, at EBRD, we're working very closely with the Green Climate Fund, and we have programs that we're implementing for them specifically designed for scaling up private renewables in Egypt and Kazakhstan. But also very important are the funds that donors give directly to IFIs to support our policy work. Trust funds, technical cooperation funds. These are going to be key in supporting the policy work that is needed for the clean energy transition. For example, to provide targeted technical assistance to establish regulatory frameworks for scaling up renewables or develop pathways for decarbonizing economies. We're already using such funds. We're currently designing renewable auctions in 14 of our countries. We're working with countries like Ukraine in the preparation of its second NDC. We're supporting countries such as Uzbekistan and Serbia to develop low carbon pathways for their energy sectors to transition away from fossil fuels. So really, just to sum up and keep to my time slot, at this critical time when it's incumbent on IFIs to help create the conditions that can enable developing countries unlock and reap the benefits of a transition to a net zero economy, we need donor governments. We need their moral support and push, but we also need their checkbooks.
Thank you very much indeed, Nandita. We have a few minutes left, so I'd like to come back on a couple of points to our distinguished panelists. And maybe a first item is that we've talked a lot about the need for scale. But there's also a very strong case for empowering small-scale activities, small and medium-sized enterprises, individual entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs. So perhaps I can ask briefly, Gurdeep, what's your perspective on that? How can we also get more of a sort of local ecosystem of small companies involved in driving change in the energy sector? And perhaps, Nandita, I could ask you as well the same question in a second.
I think, again, very good question. And I think this has to be universal. So when it is becoming universal, what we have to involve is that everyone involved in this. And it's not only that we will be just installing the solar power plant or the wind mills. I think this goes beyond that. And whether it is appliances, whether it is energy efficiency side, whether it's building side, and where it comes, I think the involvement of the small and medium enterprises becomes very important. And anyway, small and medium enterprises play a very vital role in the world economy. And at places, it goes up to 70 to 80% of their contribution. So it is important that the funding arrangement to them, the technology and the funding arrangement to them should also be the latest technology and I think the cost of fund, what we just mentioned again and again. I think this is vital. And involve, I think it cannot be just by one person or the one country or this kind of one institution. It has to be across the globe and involving everyone. It has to be it's like the humanity, and it's the total humanity has to really get involved and try to bring in. And SME really plays a very important role. And we all should try to see, including the financial institution and the other technology provider, to enable them to be part of it rather than go on utilizing the old technologies and they are burdened with the high cost, so that they will be lagging behind. I think their involvement is as vital as this overall impact of the large power stations of the renewable energy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gurdeep. Nandita, perhaps a few words from you on the same topic.
Yes, Tim. So let me just say, let me just make 2 points here, and I'll talk about renewables, and then I'll talk briefly about just transition. And in renewables, frankly, what do we need in renewables today? We need scale. We need absolutely large renewables, small renewables, any kind of renewables that we can build, and as quickly as possible. But it's very, very important when we build these renewable projects to keep in mind the local communities and the local environments we operate in. One of the projects, and you've probably heard many of us talk about it a lot, is the huge 1.8 gigawatt solar park that we're very proud of, that we built in Benban in Egypt, in the middle of the desert. A number of us IFIs, the World Bank Group, ourselves, worked very closely with the Egyptian government to make this project happen. And we attracted private investors to come and invest for 1.8 gigawatts in the desert. But what we also did was we ensured in the design of the project and the implementation to ensure that the project brought benefits to the local community, that it employed local people, that it procured local services. And so out there, if you can actually see this project from space, it's so huge. In the peak of construction, there were 10,000 jobs, all from local villages. And that's the way we need to look at renewables, as a real opportunity in our countries to create jobs and create local ecosystems, because very often these projects can be in very backward areas, poor areas, but they can also be everywhere. So I think this is one thing that we need to focus on, is that renewables can actually be an engine for creating SMEs and local employment. But the second area, which we are actually very focused on at the moment ourselves, is what we call our Just Transition Initiative. So this report talks a lot about how we need to also wean countries and all of us off fossil fuels. But where does this leave the huge parts of the world, and Gurdeep knows this better than any of us, that are dependent on coal, on fossil fuels, that have an existing ecosystem already built around it? So how do you shift that ecosystem when you stop using coal and you stop mining coal? How do you ensure that you bring benefits to that local community? And one of the ways that we are doing this is actually using the areas, the spaces and the regions where you see the currently coal and fossil fuels to develop renewables, but also looking at social and economic programs that we need to design upfront for those parts of the world. And I'll stop there, Tim.
Thank you very much, Nandita. And the last question, I'd like to come back to Mark. We're reading a lot today about the rise of sustainable finance, of green bonds, of sustainable finance frameworks. But by and large, that's really been a sort of self-contained phenomenon within Europe and North America. And we've yet to really make the link between that momentum and the sorts of things that we're talking about today in emerging and developing economies. And it's an extraordinarily difficult question to answer in a minute or two. But what would it take to get that, to make that link, to establish some of those connections between international capital markets and the needs of developing and emerging economies?
One thing, that the comments that were just made on the EBRD is a good indication of why they're a leader around this. I really believe that. I could talk more about it, but as you go around the world, your organization's pointed too often on that. There are four core issues for me. One would be the policy constraints that we talked about earlier today, the technical issues and the project-specific issues, but the core issue is the economic issue. If you talk to the private sector and you try to get them to think about moving into areas that they've not moved into before, the common refrain when the door is closed is, who should bear the risk? Who should bear the risk? This is it. And the perspective that they bring to the table for the most part, when you're talking about scale, if you're not talking about scale, you can do certain things with private sector actors and others that question is not as front and center. But when you try to get scale, that's the issue. And I believe that the institutions that are empowered by governments to make the transition that we're talking about need to think, this is my opinion as a newbie to this panel, differently about risk. If we do not do that, then there's no way we can make this transition. I'm talking now not about the transition in Europe or in North America. I'm trying to talk specifically about markets that many of you know a great deal about. To get the private sector to refocus away when they think time is their enemy. They need to invest now, and they need to have confidence around return. If they shift to an area where it takes, in general, more time, where transactions are often bespoke, they're not just printed out. If you go to one of the major investment banks, they're used to printing out bond issues many a day. How come? Because they're replicable. They're essentially the same with a few moving things. But if I go and meet with some of the most impressive people I've met with in my business career, who are currently working at some of the multilateral institutions we've been talking about today, they are often describing a unique deal. The uniqueness of the deal is not your friend, it's your enemy. Because if time is our enemy, which is what Fatih said at the very beginning of this, we don't have the time, then you cannot have unique, bespoke transactions. You need committed capital where it's very clear who has the risk. It's not a mystery. And you get the private sector then to commit to being in a senior position, for example, and that will drive the other issues, including some of the policy issues that were just described in India, that were some of which have been made, that Gurdeep described, and the same issues around technical issues and discussions with governments. If you have committed capital, you can have a better conversation with someone because they know you're real. And if you're able to do what EBRD did in Egypt on multiple times, you get people's attention. I really believe that. So if I had to summarize it in one word, it would be around risk. Thank you.
That's certainly a word that came up many times during the preparation of this report. But I'd also noticed that the word opportunity came up many times today as well. With that, I'd like to thank our panel very sincerely for those insights. And for a closing word on today's event, I pass the floor to our Executive Director, Dr. Fatih Birol.
So thank you very much to all the colleagues and institutions, first of all, being present at this launch, but more importantly, contributing to this, in my view, a reference book to be for many of us. Dear colleagues, we at the IEA, we are a very fortunate organization because we have all the energy data at our fingertips. I can assure you that when we look at the data, I see a new global energy economy is emerging. Much more modern, much more friendly with environment, and much more fair. And we at the IEA are determined to lead global clean energy transitions for the benefit for all in the world. And we count on all of you, all our partner organizations and the governments. And one word from me, I would very much like to hear from all the governments around the world at the COP meeting, before and after, that they give an unmistakable signal to the investors: invest in the future, not to the past, if you want to make money and be a part of the solution of our climate crisis. Thank you very much, and all the best to you from the International Energy Agency in Paris. Thank you.